name is Orlee Lauren, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a 15-year-old climate justice and gender equity activist. I'd like to start by thanking all of the sponsors and organizers of Mock COP26. We have 18 student staff and more than 200 volunteers who have worked very hard to put this all together, and it's worked out beautifully, so thank you. Imagine you're standing in front of a dry field. What would have been green is beige, and you wish it would rain already. You planted every seed by hand last spring, and you see no fruits from your labor. You got dirt under your nails for nothing. You ruined your favorite pair of pants for nothing. You hoped for rain, but what you got was dust and drought. I want you to imagine that this drought has made every day a battle, literally. Violence has increased because people are running out of resources and they want to protect the ones that didn't evaporate the way their water did. This drought has killed livestock and left people starving. Families that used to have hundreds of livestock now only have 2. The lack of potable water has led to disease and death, sometimes at a young age. Now I want you to stop imagining, because you don't need to. In 2015, a county in Kenya called Turkana was experiencing a severe drought. The drought affected them in all of the ways that I just described. Women and girls in Turkana had the task of walking to fetch water for their families and livestock. As global temperatures increased, their water source evaporated and became smaller and less accessible. Women and girls were forced to walk longer distances to get to a smaller body of water. Often the water was extremely unsanitary, but they had no other options. Fetching water during the day not only prevents women from going to school, it also allows men to generate income for the family without communicating where that money is going. Men are more likely to have the resources to go into town, leaving women and children to deal with the drought. And in a scenario where families do stay together, they are often forced to stay in toxic and abusive relationships, because their partners have resources like money to survive. The intersection of race and gender can also determine a woman's likelihood to survive an environmental disaster. For example, Hurricane Katrina damaged coastal cities like New Orleans. Before the hurricane hit, 1 out of every 3 people who lived in these areas hit hardest by the hurricane were African American and of low income. More than half of these low-income families of color were supported by single mothers. The intersection of race and gender put African American women at a disadvantage because they were responsible for seeking resources for their families, but that was statistically unlikely, as about 60% of poor African American families during that time didn't own a vehicle. Although we call these natural disasters, they are becoming less natural by the year. Even a small sea level rise due to climate change could pose a greater risk of tsunamis in coastal areas. Patriarchal constructs significantly impact the chances of women surviving these crises. For example, in 2004, a tsunami hit Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and India. An Oxfam report says that the ratio of surviving men to surviving women was 3-to-1, because women weren't taught how to swim, but rather they were taught to look out for their family. So when the tsunami hit, men had the chance to save themselves, while women had to look out for their relatives and were struggling to save them. The idea that a woman's role is to breed children and take care of them prevents women from achieving equality and gaining independence, especially during environmental disasters. Wangari Maathai, the founder of the Greenbelt movement, saw these injustices and decided to fight back. Like those women who were tasked with fetching water that was miles away, she was indigenous to Kenya. She spent her time responding to the needs of the rural women around her. She noticed that their streams were running dry, they had insecure food supply, and they had to walk farther to get wood and firewood for fencing. There was a drought, and Maathai was committed to helping. She noticed that the everyday struggles that she had witnessed were tied to insufficient government responses and a lack of motivation to help each other. Let's try to look at the climate crisis through Maathai's eyes. It's hard to focus on one issue related to the climate crisis because there are so many overlapping impacts. She says, "We are constantly being bombarded by problems that we face, and sometimes we can get completely overwhelmed." She tells the story of a hummingbird who sees the large forest that it lives in burn. All of the forest animals flee, but the hummingbird, even though it's tiny, wants to extinguish the fire. So it goes to the nearest stream and takes a drop of water in its beak and puts it into the fire. The forest animals watch, thinking that the hummingbird is ridiculous, when in reality, they can help too. Like hummingbirds, we all have the ability to help, but we are stronger as a group. Wangari Maathai teaches us that we should try our best to save what we have while we can, together, by organizing and speaking up against injustice. Droughts like the one I described in Kenya aren't just caused by global climate change, they are also caused by a lack of action against inequality. Climate change will exacerbate all of these social challenges and inequities and further deteriorate girls' and women's lives. In other words, climate change affects us all, but it impacts groups already vulnerable more immediately and adversely. To me, understanding that is the purpose of addressing climate justice and gender equity. We need to implement equitable climate policy that protects frontline communities. We also need to dismantle societal constructs that prevent women from being seen as equal. We can't have one without the other. For example, if the government provides all Kenyan residents with an easy access to water and education for everyone, but toxic societal norms say that women should still take care of their families, why would women go to school if the norm says not to? Conversely, if women are seen as equal, but the government doesn't grant them equal rights, how will they live as equal to their male counterparts? This should be an international effort. In the case of the Kenyan drought, other countries can contribute their share by limiting their emissions and sending help to build infrastructure that makes education, healthcare, and water more accessible. Did you know that women produce 60 to 80% of food in low-income countries, but often have less resources than the men in those same areas? These resources include land rights, training, tools, technology, capital, and credit. In Kenya, the government needs to provide women with the same resources that men have, because if people of all gender have access to the same resources, they will see a 20 to 30% increase in food production on the same land. The government needs to provide healthcare and education, among other things, so that people of all genders are equally prepared and educated on climate change. Our work is limited if we take action against climate change without supporting women and girls, specifically women and girls of color and women and girls who are living in poverty. When we see ourselves as small birds who are capable of trying their best to make their own impact, we realize that there are so many ways to implement equitable climate policy and deconstruct the patriarchy. One way that we as individuals can help is by contacting people who represent us in our government. I did this for the first time with a climate justice organization called Our Climate, which advocates for science-based and equitable climate policy. I am now a fellow for Our Climate, training other young advocates to join me in pressuring our legislators to add a gender perspective to their climate policy. You can call, email, or schedule a meeting with your government representative in order to ensure that your voice is heard. If talking to your government officials is not an option, I suggest joining or creating a nonprofit organization that will empower you to speak up. We live like the hummingbird that Maathai described, in a global forest. Our forest is in danger. Climate justice and gender equity are intersectional the way roots in a forest are. It is our role as a collective ecosystem to support each other. Thank you.